Booktube, it's Kim at Middle of the Bookmarch, and today's video is a recommendations video. As you know, I hope you know, Marilyn and I from Marilyn Maya Mendoza have teamed up to do a readathon in May for Mental Health May. In today's video, I wanted to recommend some books to any of you who are interested in taking part in the readathon. The only rule is if you do want to take part, read one book. It could be fiction, it could be nonfiction, choose whatever you would like. But I wanted to show you some books that I liked, I read. They were either helpful to me, they taught me something, or they were good examples of books with mental health themes, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. The first one I want to show you, I kind of touched on in my previous video. But this is the book that a therapist gave to me, and I read through it, and I realized this is what I have, and this is how I received my diagnosis. This is the Bipolar II Disorder Workbook, and it was put together by Stephanie McMurrick Roberts, Louisa Grandin Sylvia, Noreen A. Riley Harrington, with a foreword by David J. Miklowitz, and they're all PhDs. But she gave me this workbook and said, go home and work through this and let me know what you think. And I think I only got through the first 5 pages, and I contacted her and I'm like, yeah, this is me. And so it really is kind of a workbook. You fill in certain things. I don't think I wrote in this because she gave me the copy, and I wrote on paper, but I didn't want to write in the book at the time, but she let me keep it. But this was really helpful to me, and not only by pinpointing how I was feeling and the symptoms that I had, but it's a way to write things down. It's a way, not as a journal really, but to kind of get stuff out of your head and on paper. And for me, I'm not a journaler. I'm not a person that writes. I don't even really keep a book journal. I have a notebook that I write down ideas in, and that's good for me because it gets those out of my head so I don't forget anything, or I always have something to refer back to. But this is more of writing down how you're feeling, writing down what you're going through, and kind of matching things up to what the book is telling you. So I highly recommend that. The other one I read on my Kindle years ago, and I have been meaning to get a physical copy, and I think I probably will. This one is Two Bipolar Chicks Guide to Survival, Tips for Living with Bipolar Disorder by Wendy K. Williamson and Honora Rose. This is a fantastic book, and it is put together by 2 women with bipolar disorder. I don't have bipolar type 1, so it's going to be a very different experience for a person with bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2, and I'll explain that in a second. But this book has great ideas for how to live with the disorder. It talks about self-care. It has ideas for dealing with stress. It has tips to stay healthy. It has tips to feel good. It has ideas for what to do when you know you're not feeling good, or when you're going into a depressive state or a manic state. So it's got so many things to absorb that are positive. It also talks about what happens to your life when you do have a mental illness, and you may not have the life you ever thought you were going to have when you were young, and that's fine. That's totally okay. It also helps you kind of come to terms with, accept, and thrive with the changes that you've made in your life to survive. So I love it. I love the book. It was really good. Now I have 3 books that are great for young people, for teenagers, and one of the things I'm going to do is in May I'm going to read some children's books and some books for middle school ages and maybe for teens and young adults, because I think it's also important to give exposure to mental illness for children, to give them an outlet to talk about things, to know that it's okay to talk out loud about things, to try to help them learn how to express their feelings. This one is What to Do When You're Scared and Worried, A Guide for Kids, James J. Christ, PhD. And it's a short book, but it's also, it's a book full of tips. It's put together in a kid-friendly way, or a tween. This is really good for tweens, even kids that are old enough to come home alone from school, but are kind of nervous about it. This is a really good book for that context. This one is Depression: A Teen's Guide to Survive and Thrive by Jacqueline B. Toner and Claire A. B. Freeland. And again, it's a similar book, short, easy to digest, but this is appropriate for teens that are dealing with depression and feeling depressed. I talked about bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 and the differences. There's also a big difference between feeling depressed and having depression. I'm not going to talk about that part yet. So let me give you a quick explanation of bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. This is a quick version, and I'm not a medical professional. Bipolar type 1 is what used to be called manic depressive disorder or manic depressive illness. And it is the stereotypical idea that a lot of people already have of bipolar disorder. Very high highs, manic highs, not sleeping for 4 days, running away from home with no shoes on, spending all the money in your bank account on things you'll never use, getting into legal trouble, trying to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, getting into hypersexuality and trouble around that. A lot of different ways that disorder in a manic state comes out. It is very often attributed to artists, to writers, to painters, Van Gogh. And then you have the low state, the depressive state. So there's different extremes. And depressive can mean that it's suicidal depression, that you don't eat for a week, that you sleep all the time, that you can't stop crying, that you attempt to end your own life, or honestly, sometimes you succeed. So that is bipolar type 1, and that's a stereotypical description. My mother had bipolar type 1. I have bipolar type 2, and bipolar type 2 is a much more, I can't think of the best word to describe it. It's a chronic, a lifelong, kind of a daily thing where it's not this peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys. It's kind of rolling hills and maybe a roller coaster here and there. But it comes out for me in depression and sadness, or anger and anxiety. So those are kind of the manic depressive extremes, but they're not really extremes. Sometimes it's been said that bipolar type 2 can be more concerning only because it's chronic and you can't see it. A person with bipolar type 2 often doesn't communicate that. They're either embarrassed, scared, or ashamed to talk about it. It's it's always around, you're always aware of it, so you don't want to bother anybody about it. So those are the two very quick basic descriptions of the two types of bipolar disorders. And then the last one for teens is another workbook. This is BU, a workbook for teens by Brooke Waters. This one has a lot of activities and journal opportunities. It has a lot of lists and advice and can be really helpful. I think there's coloring in here. Yeah, there is. There's things that you can color at the back. A lot of people find coloring soothing, and these are mandalas. I think that's how you pronounce that. And so it's a really fun workbook, and it also is good for giving teens something to do and trying to get things out on paper and pull them out of their own head. And it doesn't cure anything, but it helps. It helps to pass the time, and it helps to soothe. I think that's the biggest advantage to workbooks like that. So the next pile are books. This is a book that I have already read and I'm going to reread in May. This is An Unquiet Mind, a Memoir of Moods and Madness by Kay Redfield Jamison. Kay Redfield Jamison is a physician. She's a professor, or was a professor of psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. This book was published in, 1995. And this is a former library copy. What I just noticed is somebody wrote in the title page, filled the entire title page, and I actually don't like it when other people's writing is in used books, but I am going to definitely read that because that's going to be interesting. But she was a physician and a professor, and she ended up being diagnosed with bipolar disorder after so many situations and events that were disturbing to her, and that she realized she had a medical problem and finally found out what it was. And I read this a long time ago. I'm really excited to reread it in May. The next two, I wanted to show you these two and suggest them because they give so much light and exposure to a real person with a real disorder and their life and what they go through on a daily and a yearly basis. But this is The Bell Jar from Sylvia Plath, and this is her fictional account of her life, basically. And she details her mental disorder. She wasn't calling it anything when she wrote this book, and she wasn't even calling it anything during her life. She had a lot of, she had a lot of moments of despair. She had a lot of moments of manic behavior. She had several suicide attempts. And it's easy for us as lay people to look at the life of Sylvia Plath, and it's easy for me at this point in my life to look at her life and say she most likely had manic depressive illness, bipolar disorder. She was hospitalized several times. She was subjected to electroshock therapy in its infancy, which was pretty torturous. She was on a lot of medications, so there's a lot to deal with. This is the fictional account of her life as a young person. And there's so much in here, so much insight. And she lets you have a glimpse into what her life was really like. And this is Red Comet from Heather Clark, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath. I read this, and then I reread The Bell Jar, and it brought so many things into so much more clarity. But this is an exhaustive, heavily researched book of Sylvia Plath's life. And it's amazing. I absolutely loved it. I learned so much. And you can see patterns. You can see patterns of her mental illness. You can read how she dealt with it, how her family dealt with it, and it led up to her suicide at a very young age. So I love that book. I know it's so long and it's so intimidating. It's highly detailed, but I absolutely loved it. This one is a graphic memoir, and it's an author that deals with anxiety, and this is Hyperbole and a Half by Allie Broche. Now, I'm not going to be concentrating on anxiety in May. Marilyn is going to be taking that mantle on, but I thought I would still recommend this book. It's easy to get through. It's these totally simplistic drawings, but it's really super funny. I laughed out loud in so many places. But there are also places where it can get fairly dark, and she talks about her childhood and her past and her family. And so, you know, as always with my videos on mental health, I put a disclaimer in the front of the video, and I'm going to add that there may be some triggering things in this book, and as well as the last two that I'm going to show you. This one it's kind of a funny story by Ned Vizzini, and this can be considered a young adult novel. This is an autobiographical novel of Ned's experiences in a psychiatric hospital. He lived in New York City, and he knew that he was spiraling. He was feeling major depression, and he kind of walked himself into a hospital, and he said, "I need help." And he did get help, and he was treated for depression. He was hospitalized, and I think he was hospitalized more than once. Unfortunately, he took his own life at the age of 32 after writing the book, after getting married, after having a child. And it's kind of a picture of major depression that is just simply not treated once and then you're cured. It can be a lifelong disorder. It can be lifelong management. There is no magic pill. There is a lot of medication that works for a lot of people, but not always. And this is a very easy novel to read, but it's also difficult and heartbreaking to read what he went through in a fictional account. And then this one I just read last year, maybe. This is very good. This is Don't Call Me Crazy. 33 Voices Start the Conversation About Mental Health, edited by Kelly Jensen. this is really good. This is an essay collection, and there are people in here who are well known to us, who maybe are media personalities or famous, or you're going to recognize their names, and there are other people that aren't famous at all, but they had something to add to this collection. And this is a really good time to mention calling a person crazy, or calling a person with a mental illness crazy, or there are many other negative stereotypes or negative words that you can ascribe to a person with a mental illness. This is that. This is, don't call me crazy, because a person with a mental illness is not crazy. There are times when a person can act in a crazy way as we ascribe the definition, the stereotypical definition, to crazy. So that's what this book addresses, and these essays are wonderful. There's so much insight and so many opportunities for us to learn from people who live with a mental illness. So I highly recommend this one. That is it. I have to say, there are so many books out there on mental illness topics and themes that are wonderful. This is such a small portion. These are books that I've read that I enjoyed, or I learned something from, or I felt showed me something important. So I highly recommend all of these books. Let me know in the comments below if you have any thoughts, or if you've read any of them, or if you would like to, or anything you think about any of the selections I showed you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, everybody.